Thank you very much for being here, and I think you're in for a very interesting presentation. Some of us heard Dr. Emery present at least some version of this last week, and I've heard him present little bits and pieces here and there on several occasions. I met Dr. Emery on Twitter, which perhaps is appropriate for a talk, someone coming to give a talk on technology, but let me tell you just a little bit about him. Dr. Emery has a recently minted PhD from the University of California, Irvine. His field of study is broadly political science, but more specifically war and ethics. And he's particularly interested in, and his dissertation covers technology and technological optimism, I think, to some extent, about the way technology may transform our understandings of war. He is a graduate of Gonzaga, and I mention this in part because what I think for him was a fairly formative experience was a year in Florence, in the Gonzaga Florence program, which I know some of you have experienced as well. This actually ties into his research to some extent because he is not only a fluent Italian speaker, but has incorporated some of the work of Giambattista Vico, Renaissance humanist, into his work on technology, war, and ethics. Dr. Emery is a lecturer at Chapman University in Orange County and teaches both in their graduate program and teaches undergraduate courses as well. And he is published fairly widely in journals relating to ethics and war, including ethics and international affairs. He's published on drone warfare. He's published on some of the issues that you'll hear him talk about today, but has a very interesting perspective and I think a lot to add to this topic. So please join me in welcoming Dr. John R. Emery.
Thank you so much, Dr. Williams, for the invitation, and Alice for coordinating and organizing this. The title of my talk today is Killer Robots, Artificial Intelligence and the Future of War. So I'm just going to be able to touch a little bit on each of these. I'm going to try and keep it to about 30 or 40 minutes, so we can have time for about 20 minutes of Q&A at the end. So if anything comes up or you have any confusion or any questions arise, keep it till the end and we'll go through it. So, in general, my research is focused on kind of ethics of war and how different technologies of war impact the way we think about ethics and the way we fight wars. And so I was driven by this kind of initial puzzle when I first started my PhD research, which is a quote by General Michael Hayden, the former NSA director: "We kill people based on metadata." Right? So I see this and I think, what's going on here? How does this partake in kind of everyday warfare? So as many of you know, the CIA operated covert drone strikes in places like Yemen, Pakistan, and Somalia for a number of years, and this kind of became what many call the soul of the Obama presidency, right? So even though he was drawing down troops in Iraq, he was engaging in a broader counterterror warfare. And so the metadata aspect really interests me because in general, the way we think about ethics of war is when you're a soldier, you're a combatant, you have a right to kill other combatants, but then you also take on a risk of being killed as well. That's what we do as soldiers, and that's what you do in order to protect civilian life. So I was wondering how they do it. And luckily, there are some leaked NSA PowerPoint slides of how they go about targeting individuals in these tribal areas of Yemen and Pakistan. And what's interesting about this is essentially the NSA teamed up with the CIA and they'd fly drones over the tribal areas of Pakistan and they'd gather up metadata from your cell phones, right? So they'd take on all this data from your cell phone, where you're traveling, who you're traveling with, who you're calling, do you power down your phone frequently, who are you calling, kind of all these different elements. And then they'd pump it through a machine learning algorithm to determine your probability of terroristness, right? So even though it was called this targeted killing campaign, what really fascinated me about it is that we didn't actually know who we were targeting. we were targeting a what, which is a metadata construction of who we think might be a terrorist. Right? So this is a really fascinating puzzle for thinking about ethics and technology especially. And so just to give you a little background and statistics of what the US drone program has done. So we've had about 6,700 confirmed strikes. 430 took place in Pakistan, 329 in Yemen, 139 in Somalia, and then the vast majority have taken place in Afghanistan since 2015. So technically in 2015, we switched our mission there. It was no longer technically Operation Enduring Freedom, so that's when statistics kind of started being taken there. And I have graphs at the end if you want to see those, so you can kind of see the breakdown of which president struck the most in which places. But in general, you have about 8,000 to 12,000 killed, right? These are very difficult areas to determine data accurately and count civilian casualties, right? Not a lot of people can enter there, and there's a lot of contradictory information. And so the Bureau of Investigative Journalism is the source that most academics use because they give us a wide range and kind of the best methodology for counting both civilians and potential combatants killed. And as you'll see, civilian casualties, some might say are quite low. It's roughly about 10%. But the interesting thing about drones is that the appeal to drones and the reason why even President Obama said that we use drones is that technology is so precise, right? There's all these appeals to precision, appeals to the superior technology that we use to kill, right? But the idea is that if we have such precise technology, then why are we still having this number of civilian casualties? Right? And so the way we tend to think about the evolution of warfare, right, comes from this idea that, and even the way the US Air Force talks about it is, in World War II, we had to make horrible decisions. Right, the firebombing of Dresden, the firebombing of Tokyo, the dropping of the atomic bombs, and the Vietnam War as well, right? We had a very controversial, we might say, policy of kind of carpet bombing, of napalm, of ecocide, right, Agent Orange. And then we get to the first Gulf War, which is called the most precise war in history, right? There's this idea that we are able to kill with this advanced technology, and we're able to win the war in a matter of days. Right? So less than a month, we took out one of the largest armies that invaded Kuwait. And then we get to the shock and awe campaign of 2003 Iraq War, where we take out a bunch of sites on the first night with precision-guided munitions. And so there's this kind of appeal to this, and there's this appeal to this kind of narrative that on the one hand, technology is getting better, and we are killing fewer civilians than we used to in war. Right? But a problem with this is we forget that in World War II, we actively targeted civilians. Right? We wanted to attack their cities in order to combat enemy morale. Right? And so we forget that there's also evolving norms that we don't necessarily want to kill as many civilians anymore, as well as strategic ideals that we want to win the hearts and minds, right? If you're running a counterinsurgency operation, you don't necessarily want to kill indiscriminately. And so we have all these interacting forces, but the general narrative seems to be that technology is getting better, therefore we are inherently engaging in a more ethical war, right? But even with drone technology, you're firing Hellfire missiles, which are anti-tank munitions, oftentimes into crowds of people. Right? And what you get there is actually a lot of horror, a lot of bloodshed, right? It's very horrific for those kind of living on the ground under drones. And there's a number of Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International reports that talk about that. And then we get to this idea today that war is kind of more precise, right? That we're engaged in this kind of special operations, knocking down doors. We have killer robots, whether they be on the ground or artificially intelligent drones, and then kind of cruise missile strikes. And what this misses a lot of is that we've still engaged in a lot of conventional war. If you look at the fight against the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, what you actually see is a massive kind of conventional bombing campaign. Right? We bombed Iraq and Syria over 1,000 days, conducted tens and tens of thousands of strikes. Right? And so there's still these conventional bombings going on, even when kind of drones are getting the spotlight. And to top that off, some recent reports showed that JSOC, which is the kind of Joint Special Operations Forces, are operating in 149 countries globally. Right? So there's this idea that there's truly this global war on terror that knows no bounds. You'll remember maybe about a year ago, there was a US troop killed in Niger, right? And what was fascinating about this is there were even people on the Senate Armed Services Committee that said, I didn't even know we had troops in Niger. Right? So all of this is kind of taking place behind the purview of, kind of democratic debate and the kind of political decision-making that should be taking place here in the United States, right? On where we send our troops, where we're engaged in warfare globally, and kind of the political and economic ramifications of that. So if you look just kind of at costs of war, there's a great project, it's costofwar.org, run by Nita Crawford at Brown University, and she calculates the amount of money that the US wars in Afghanistan and Iraq have cost. And she calculates it with a number of teams of economists and sociologists, and they estimate the amount to be around $6 trillion. Right? And if you take that and think about what you could do with $6 trillion, it's absolutely staggering. Right? And what we forget about the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan is that even though we had a lot fewer troops die than we did in the Vietnam War, roughly about 7,000 in the most recent wars, we had a lot more troops that were injured. Right? A lot of people were injured, but there's kind of two advances. One in medical care, to where troops that used to die on the battlefield are no longer dying, and two, we had air superiority, so we could evacuate them quickly. So even though the casualty numbers on our side don't necessarily show the horrors of the last 18 years of warfare, that really it's still there, and the problem with that is that you have to then pay a lifetime of benefits. Right? And so there's a lot of appeals to this kind of artificial intelligent technology by saying that, look, we don't want to put our troops in harm's way. It's going to be much more cost effective. So you get kind of economic as well as ethical arguments in favor of this. So I want to critique this kind of logic a little bit. There's this, what I like to call a technological problem solving, right? For every problem in the world, there's a technical solution to it, right? Not recognizing the political dilemmas that kind of come forth from it. And one thing that's very evident to me in the US global war on terror is that we're neglecting the ends of war by perfecting the means of war. What I mean by that is we're so focused on perfecting the technology of war, winning in the artificial intelligence arms race, that we're really neglecting the bigger questions, which are, how do we win the war on terror? How do we end war justly in Afghanistan? How do we pull troops out of Iraq? Right? How do we keep the homeland safe? Right? These are kind of all basic questions that have been neglected in recent times, instead focusing on the kind of technology we're using to kill. Right? And for me, the problem with this is it dissolves kind of complex ethical and political dilemmas into kind of engineering problems to be solved, as if there's a right answer, as if we can know the future of what may happen if we negotiate with the Taliban like we're doing now and pull out of Afghanistan. Right? Or if we can know that if we stay there just 10 more years, what the outcome might be. Right? This isn't a mathematical problem to be solved. These are complex political dilemmas. And when we forget that, we kind of fall victim to this logic that allows us to think that there are easy answers to these questions. And ultimately, in a democratic society, we should solve these problems through kind of collective political debate. Maybe that's just a little bit of an idealist in me. You'll hear the pessimist in me in the second half of the talk. Right? And so one thing that's always sticks in my mind about kind of contemporary technologies of war is how ethics of due care has kind of shifted. So in Michael Walzer's Just and Unjust Wars, any of you who have taken Dr. Williams' Ethics of War class have probably read this kind of classic work. He talks about how soldiers need to exercise due care in order to protect civilian casualties. Right? And the example that he gives us is World War I, there's a British soldier kind of clearing out houses in the French countryside of German soldiers, but there's also civilians in hiding, right? So what the soldier can do when they're going into the basement, they can either throw a grenade down on the off chance there's German soldiers hiding in the basement, or they can call down first and tell people to come out, right? By doing that, they expose themselves to some risk, right? There may be families hiding in the basement, but at the same time, there may be German soldiers that they're alerting that they're going to be coming in, and then they can put up a fight, right? But what Walzer wants to say is this is exercising due care. Soldiers must put themselves at some risk in order to protect civilian life. Right? And what's difficult in drone warfare is that soldiers are no longer at risk. Right? And then when we especially take humans out of the loop, there's no longer soldiers operating the drones when they're doing it with artificial intelligence, right? It's a complete asymmetric conflict. Right? Now, some ethicists find no problem with asymmetry, right? They say that we should protect our soldiers first and then worry about their civilians later, but I kind of take the opposite approach, where I think civilians first need to be protected, and yes, we should protect our soldiers within reason, but they're also soldiers, and they also need to expose themselves to some risk in order to fight justly. It's what we expect our soldiers to do. And in addition to having this kind of technology of warfare with drones and kind of a future of killer robots is we construct war as inherently more ethical and less bloody, right? And my worry is that it will cause us to intervene in places where we wouldn't be going to war otherwise, right? I doubt we would be at war right now in Somalia with troops on the ground or in tribal areas of Pakistan, right? But with drones, it's easy because you don't expose yourself to risk, and it has pretty broad popularity at home, right? The idea is that you're killing the bad guys and your troops aren't at risk, right? That sells very well, and it shows that you're doing something about terrorism. And within all of this, we have this further idea that we're somehow individualizing warfare, right? We're no longer bombing cities, but we can take out individuals. But like I showed you with the kind of leaks from the NSA and the way we're targeting with SIM card metadata, we're no longer actually targeting individuals. We're targeting heterogeneous constructions of individuals based on their metadata, right? And so just think about the metadata that is tracked from you from all the sites that you visit and everything like that. If you could be flagged for investigation, right? But in general, we don't have a problem with the business applications of that. But then think, would I want my algorithmic code to determine someone's life or death, right? And I think most software engineers would probably say no to that, right? I think it's good for targeting ads for you. When you visit something, then you see the ads pop up for days and days and days on end, right? But applying that to a killing machine is very different. And so some of you may have heard of Project Maven. It made it into the news a while back. It was part of the Department of Defense's algorithmic warfare cross-functional team, right? And so basically what they were doing is they were partnering with Google to fly drones over active combat zones of Syria, Iraq, and different parts of Africa. And they were training this machine learning algorithm in order to take in kind of all these visual stimuli and train it to identify targets, right? So the Department of Defense says, we're developing this targeting software within drones to automatically detect, recognize, classify, identify, and target personnel and ground platforms or other targets of interest, right? And so there was a big uproar from a lot of Google employees. They say, we don't want to be involved in the Department of Defense's drone program. And so they let their contract expire, which was somewhere of the tune of $400 to $450 million, right? But so that was something that they were really pushing for because they didn't want to be involved in this. Because they understand, even though drones are trained on this kind of terrain and that it's kind of learning from these things, that it still makes mistakes, right? You need to understand kind of a cultural context on the ground and everything else in order to know what to target, right? It's not like an open battlefield where you can say only target tanks, right? Because enemies of today aren't necessarily using tanks. And so you run into these kind of dilemmas that some companies in Silicon Valley and some software engineers are saying, you know, we don't want to be a part of this. On the opposite end of the spectrum, there's a lot of money to be made, and there's others who are actively involved in this. So there's a guy named Palmer Luckey. He kind of made it in the news a while back because he was a 26-year-old who developed this virtual reality kind of software and headset, and someone ended up buying his company, or Facebook ended up buying his company for the tune of $3 billion, right? And he was estimated to get about 700 million of that, right? So this 26-year-old guy who famously shows up in his Hawaiian shirts and flip-flops to business meetings was recently awarded a military AI contract as part of this Project Maven. And what's interesting about it is that he kind of takes the opposite approach of Google and Project Maven. He even wrote an op-ed criticizing them, saying that we need to be on the forefront of this, you're neglecting the US military, and that we need to be the ones kind of designing this AI, because the better technology we get, the more ethical we can be. So he kind of epitomizes for me the kind of techno-optimist that my work kind of tries to push back against. And so basically the program that he was working on for the Pentagon, which was reported in The Intercept, talked about they were going to fly in drones and different things to do kind of 3D terrain mapping of any war zone. And so I'll quote him kind of at length here just so you can get a sense of what he's talking about. He says, "What we're working on is taking data from lots of different sensors, putting them into an AI-powered sensor fusion platform so that you can build a perfect 3D model of everything, right, going on in a large area. Then we take that data, run predictive analytics, and tag everything with metadata, and find what's relevant, then push it to people in the field." Right? So they want to quantify the entire complex battlefield. He says, "Practically speaking, in the future, I think soldiers are going to be superheroes who have the power of perfect omniscience over their area of operations, where they know where every enemy is, where every friend is, where every asset is." Right? You can see the kind of video game Silicon Valley mentality here, right? The idea that you can go into such a complex environment and to be able to easily determine, like highlight in red and green, who are your friends and who are your enemies, very much thinks like a video game, right? But is not accurate of the reality that you would see on the ground, right? The problem with artificial intelligence, even that we see today in self-driving cars, right, is it works really well in simple environments, right? But it really fails in complex environments. And war is the most complex environment that you can ever have. And he goes on to say that technological superiority is a prerequisite for ethical superiority. Right? And this is kind of the most troubling element to me, and it epitomizes the technological determinism. Nothing is inherent in the technology. Sure, it can allow us to be more ethical on the battlefield, but that's also a political, strategic, and tactical choice, right? This technology doesn't make you more ethical. It's the way that you use and deploy it, right? So you forget that it's not just inherent to the tech itself, but it's how we decide to use it. And so then we move on to talking about kind of the crux of what killer robots are, right? So when we tend to think of killer robots, we tend to think about like Terminator or something like that. But what seems most likely right now is essentially making these drones that are currently remotely piloted by US Air Force personnel at Creech Air Force Base in Nevada or abroad or even the CIA, and essentially allowing these drones to do the targeting itself. So there's an important distinction between executing a targeting decision and generating a targeting decision. And so executing a targeting decision is essentially you would pre-program in the drones what they're allowed to target, right? And then they could only target those things on the ground. So the idea you can only target tanks, right, would be something very easy to program that would very much fall within the kind of ethics and laws of war. Generating targeting decision is much more difficult. Right? To generate a targeting decision, you have to apply the criteria of jus in bello, which are the kind of laws of war, which are discrimination, which is being able to distinguish between combatants and non-combatants, right? Between fighters and civilians, and proportionality, which is not generating excessive harm. Your attack needs to be proportionate to the military aim that you want to achieve. Right, so it's not outlawing that you can't kill any civilians, but it's saying that it needs to be balanced proportionately. You can't take out an entire city to get one guy or to get, kind of one strategically minor important aspect. Right, and so the fear in robots being able to generate target decisions is they have to apply this criteria and determine whether an individual is a legitimate target or not, and then a calculation of whether a particular course of action will generate excessive harm. right? And what this misses is that these are all kind of political decisions that go into it, right? You can't just tell a robot to go kill these bad guys that are on the list, right? It neglects the kind of wider context that's going on at the time. So for example, if you want to enter into negotiations with the warring party, right, it would be very difficult to say, don't target these things today, right? Because you're training it to do what you want it to do. And what's difficult about this even furthermore is that we have this idea that these drones will have this kind of perfect rationality, right? They'll be devoid of emotion, bias, all those things that we fear, anger, right? That we think that soldiers are kind of subject to on the battlefield, right? But while it eliminates that, it also eliminates the positives of humanity, right? Fear, compassion, empathy, pity, things that you see on the battlefield a lot of times. So being at UCI, I get to interview a lot of Marines that use their GI Bill that come up from Camp Pendleton. And some of the Marines I talked to that fought on the streets of Fallujah in Iraq for a couple tours talk about how they'd hold themselves to a higher standard. Right? Sometimes they were told that there was a 51% rule. If your life was 51% in danger, you could go ahead and pull the trigger. And one of the soldiers I interviewed told me that there were multiple times where people in his squad would have pulled the trigger, but he decided not to because he never took a shot he regretted. Right? And that was very important for him ethically to be able to say that I'm not going to take that shot. And what killer robots lack is that agency, right? The ability to do otherwise. Even when you may be legally or ethically allowed to take another life, right? Robots don't have that choice to be able to say no, right? Because it's all pre-programmed. And another problem with this perfect rationality is that it's not as if this robot is, kind of this perfect, ideal, objective machine, right? It's programmed by individuals who write the algorithm, right? And unconsciously, oftentimes, program their own bias and understanding about the world into that program, right? Everyone who writes software makes judgments on how they write it and the algorithm that they use, right? And the fear is that once you unleash this kind of artificial intelligence, then you won't be able to determine why robots make the decision that they make. Right? And so I want to give you a couple examples here of how you train artificial intelligence through reinforcement learning, so you get a better sense of what I'm talking about here. So some of you may have seen kind of Google DeepMind. They created the AlphaGo, which was defeated the world champion Lee Sedol at the game Go, which is kind of one of the most difficult games to play ever. Right? And so the way AI learns is that it just plays millions of iterations against itself in order to find the kind of best way to play, right? So Google DeepMind's AlphaGo was making moves that no human had ever moved before. Lee Sedol didn't really know how to respond to it, right? And it ended up winning. And although this is great and fascinating, right, it works very well in kind of games where there are set rules and objectives, right? There are no set rules and objectives necessarily in warfare. There's constantly moving goalposts, and those constantly change based on political situation at home, economic situation, the way the war is progressing, etc. And I put in this kind of funny 90s kind of racing-style video game to illustrate a point that took place with one of Elon Musk's kind of pet companies in Silicon Valley, which I just forgot the name of. Not really important, but basically they were trying to train autonomous cars on these kind of old games. And so what they were doing initially was that the car would go along and it would need to maximize points by avoiding all the barricades and stuff like that, right? But what happened after a while was that the AI learned that the best way to maximize points was to keep crashing into things, right? Because if it crashes into things, it gets to keep playing the game and it never finishes the race. Right, so what the programmers didn't realize by telling it to maximize points, that neglected the kind of unspoken objective in the end, which is to finish the race. Right? And the problem with AI is that since it plays millions of iterations against itself, we can never understand why it made the decision that it made. We just know that based on the algorithm, it was kind of the best rational, objective decision to make at the time. And so we get now to the issue of swarm drones. This has kind of been in the news a lot more lately and has kind of captured the attention of a lot of military thinkers and kind of people in practice. The idea is that you have a group of drones that autonomously communicates with one another and works as a swarm, whether a swarm of bees or a bird swarm, to kind of overwhelm the enemy. Right? And you can see how this would be very appealing. Right? In the kind of wars of the future, you can't necessarily have a human operator doing something in order to operate it, right? Because if you get a signal jam, then you lose kind of signal and you can no longer control it, or someone can control it on your behalf, right? And then they communicate to each other and they work in ways that individual operators couldn't because of the speed at which they operate, right? And Paul Scher wrote in Foreign Policy, the problem with this is the idea that you can have 1 million mistakes a second, right? So the algorithms are great until they start failing. And a perfect example of something like this is the flash crash, the financial crisis that happened in 2008. The algorithms that all the people on Wall Street had developed were going to eliminate risk. Right? The idea was that they had kind of tamed chance in the stock market, and they could know what to do and how to do it and when to do it. But the problem is they never calculated or factored in systemic risk. So when the financial crisis hit, all these algorithms didn't work, right? And the CFO of Goldman Sachs said that during the height of the financial crisis, they were seeing things on their algorithms that were 25 standard deviations away from what the algorithm would have predicted, right? So for those of you who aren't quantitatively oriented in here, like 25 sigma is astronomical. So 20 sigma is 10 times all the known particles in the universe, right? So they were seeing things happen during the financial crisis that, according to their algorithms, were the same statistical probability as winning the Powerball 21 times in a row, right? So beyond impossible, right? But what it shows is that understanding, the ideas that you build into the code will kind of influence the outcome. So the worry with swarm drones is that they can, one, go out of control, and two, you don't really know how they're going to react to an active battlefield where the enemy is actively trying to undermine the technological capabilities. And then a problem is then you come to rely on that technology and won't necessarily have backup plans, right? This is viewed as the solution. And somewhat more frighteningly, we now have human-machine integration, right? So now it's possible to telepathically communicate with swarm drones. So all you do is insert a microchip into your skull, right? No problems there, whoever volunteers for that surgery, right? But there's all kinds of ethical dilemmas here, and everyone's talking about kind of super soldiers of the future, these kind of human enhancements of soldiers. Right? And ethically, it's completely problematic, but this is the direction that the technology is going, and essentially the Department of Defense has adopted the Silicon Valley mantra, which is move fast and break things, right? Which is a lot more problematic when you're killing people as opposed to trying to get a product to market. So I wanted to talk a little bit and kind of round out the talk with the idea of the future of war and focus specifically on a war game exercise from 2002 called Operation Millennium Challenge. Right, so this war game exercise was the most expensive to date in the US. It was $250 million, took 2 years to plan, and essentially it was a war game exercise that the US military was playing in the Persian Gulf, fighting against either Iraq or Iran, in order to show off their network-centric warfare, so in order to show off all their technologies. And they were trying to establish what warfare in 2010 would look like. Right? So there was a general who was red teaming, so he was playing the enemy. His name was General Van Ripper, which is the perfect general name to be the enemy, right? And he was playing them, and what he decided to do, instead of wait for the US to attack, right, was to preempt the preemptors. And so what he did is he simultaneously launched a bunch of ground-based missiles, had a bunch of fishing boats and speedboats do suicide attacks against the entire US Navy. Right? So this war game exercise that was supposed to go on for weeks was over in 5 minutes because the US wasn't expecting it. Right? The enemy went low-tech. They weren't using radio communications. They were flying low. They were using handwritten messages, et cetera. Right? And so Van Ripper said that what we need to do is not think the enemy is going to fight the way we expect them to fight. right? And the Department of Defense was not very happy with this. They said, we just spent $250 million on this. It can't be over in 5 minutes. Refloat the ships. You can't play that way, right? So he ended up resigning in protest at the time because he said, you're expecting the enemy to fight the way that you want, not the way that they may fight, right? And you're exposing yourself to vulnerabilities by over-reliance on this technology. Because when you're high-tech, the enemy can go low-tech and kind of undermine a lot of your advantage. Right? If you go handwritten messages instead of using cell phones, right, it's a lot less convenient, but at the same time, the NSA flying overhead can't intercept your SIM card metadata. Right? So I wanted to give you some kind of preliminary conclusions, and then we'll have plenty of time for a Q&A. And I can also show you the graphs at the end if anyone's interested for drone strikes. But as the last example shows, we're generally very bad about predicting the future, especially when it comes to warfare. Right? If you think about everyone predicting what war would be back in 1988, they wouldn't have predicted the fall of the Soviet Union. Right? Predicting future of warfare in 2000, you wouldn't have predicted 9/11. Right? There's all these elements about the future that are unknown. And so even though we have to prepare for a future of war, right, we can't do it in a deterministic way and thinking that we know that the way wars are going to be fought. Right? Will we continue fighting terrorism in 10 years, or will it be a great power conflict with China or Russia? Right? Prepare for all simultaneously. Right? So artificial intelligence and lethal autonomous weapon systems, as I kind of gave you a snapshot today, raise new ethical, political, and especially legal challenges for the future, right? I don't have all the answers, but there's a lot of us trying to work through them, right? But I think we can all agree that the move fast and break things route is not necessarily the correct answer to pursue. We cannot technologically solve ethical dilemmas that come with killing and warfare, right? We can't keep divorcing ourselves from the act of killing, right? Because then it just makes it easier to do so. Right? The more and more we technologize war and remove any risk from us, the more apt we are to engage in places around the world where we might not be engaging before, and by so, generating new risks and new threats against us. Furthermore, war is a collective endeavor. We as a democratic society ought to decide when we go to war and when we don't, right? Or at least our elected representatives. But they've been kept in the dark throughout the global war on terror on a lot of these shadow wars, right? And so we all bear some collective responsibility in a democratic society in order to hold our governments accountable for what they're doing. In the end, we have a lot of false promises, techno-optimism, techno-determinism of this kind of perfect rationality in artificial intelligence. But in the end, you can't ever remove the human from that, right? It's imbued with our values, our judgments, and what we want it to do. The more we move toward this technologization of warfare, the more we divorce it from the kind of core ethics that should be guiding the way in which we engage and the seriousness with which we take life around the world. So I'll leave it at that and open it up for questions and comments. Thank you for your time.
We have some time for questions. We are recording this, so if you could wait for the mic, if you have your hand raised, I'll make my way over to you.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I'm Frederick Gylling, and I'm studying here up at the Graduation School for Business, GradueDU School for Business. I think it was very interesting. I would say probably I'm in the batch of the techno-optimist here, and I think you're painting a really nice picture of war nowadays, and also back in the days with the first World War I and stuff, because I think that's some examples, but I think it's not representative for what war actually is. I think there's a lot of examples in the other direction where you have a lot of very bad things, going on in Vietnam and also in Second and First World War with a lot of things from that that soldiers are doing, not because they're soldiers, because they are frustrated people and fighting these battles. And I think a lot of this can be mitigated through having more rational decisions behind it. I think it's a little bit back to this dilemma with the train, right? Should you should you jump in, like should you turn it to the left or to the right? There's 2 kids there and an old grandma there and stuff. And I think that dilemma in itself, it's a little bit like outspoken. I think it's maybe spoken about too much because, for example, with the driverless car, when are you in this situation? You're really rarely in that situation, and if you're put in front of such a situation, it's probably nicer that you could think about it at home instead of had to do it right in the moment. So I think you're painting a picture of that and you're really believing in that the human at this moment of stress can take intelligent decisions. But I think at this point it's a really primitive part of our brain that is working. And we are not really utilizing actually the human intelligence in that situation. So I'm like, are you on your, is it, I think what I'm stretching, like what I'm going for is that, what is the objective here? Is it to kind of counter this techno-optimism, or is it to move towards some kind of more ethical discussion about it? Because I think in this, there's a big need for people like you, but I also think that it doesn't work if there's just throwing mud from each side, right? So how do you think that you can somehow combine it, and what do you see the larger objective of war in the future?
Thank you so much for the question. So kind of a lot of things to unpack there, right? Yeah, so obviously I was kind of giving the narrative of kind of the improving technologies of war, that is to say like World War I, World War II, absolutely horrific, same with Vietnam. And on the other hand, even though, I'm very much promoting keeping the human in, right? Humans are very fallible, right? Humans make bad decisions. Humans, commit atrocities. Right? All these things were done, without the aid of technology, right? And so we need to recognize, on the one hand, we don't want to have kind of a techno-determinism, but on the other, we don't want to kind of fetishize the idea of just having a human there will somehow make things, more ethical, right? And so what I really want to do in kind of my work and a lot of the people studying this is, take a step back and say that the technology, it might be better, right? It's not necessarily like the trolley problems like you talked about and we talked about in Dr. Williams' course last week, right? It's not necessarily, these trolley problems where it's easy ethical decision making, right? You see a lot more complex ethical decision making in war, and in war, the training kicks in, right? But on the one hand, the way we train soldiers matter, the way we help them to come home also matters, right? So pretty much everyone in officer training school today, at least in US and British military academies, they're reading Michael Walzer's Just and Unjust Wars, right? And the value of his book is that he draws from kind of concrete historical examples, and he gives you these kind of vivid examples of dilemmas that soldiers actually face in the field. Right? Like, just, can you kill an enemy combatant as a sniper when he's bathing in the river, or does he have to be kind of in uniform, right? So there's these dilemmas that you wouldn't necessarily get in kind of a trolley problem type ethical dilemma that soldiers actually face. So in the end, I just want to avoid a kind of optimism and thinking that the future of war is going to be a certain way, and then we strategically kind of get undermined by having it turn out a kind of different way. So I'm not sure if I answered every element, but we'll move on to the next question. Thanks.
My name's Dan Caldwell. I'm a professor here, and I wrote a book on the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. I did a number of interviews with members of the military, and the most haunting interview I had was with a young first lieutenant who was in special forces, and it was in a company of 8 soldiers, and they came on an Afghan village, and they were fired upon from the village. So he had a couple of options. One is to attack the village with his soldiers, increasing the risk to his own soldiers. Yeah. Second was to call in artillery, increasing the possibility of civilian casualties. Third was to call in a drone. Fourth was to call in aircraft. Yeah. This young soldier was just a couple of years older than most of the students here. And so he had to make that choice. And he chose the first option. And he lost 2 of his men who were killed by the insurgents in the village. His colonel flew in after the engagement and said, what was going on here? And this young soldier described what happened and his options. And the colonel said, no human being should have to make that kind of a choice. And I think that's one of the reasons that of the 2.6 million people who've served in Iraq and Afghanistan, that the VA estimates about 20% have PTSD.
Yeah.
So that's more than 500,000, more than 500,000. And I'm wondering just, how would that young soldier, how would he apply some of the ethical principles that you write about, that Robert and I have written about? How would those help him make that almost impossible decision?
Yeah, very good question, and it's a perfect example that kind of highlights, the real tensions and dilemmas, and something that results in soldiers in what we kind of call today moral injury, right? This idea that taking a life is difficult, and we think that, in general, it should be difficult, right? And having to make those decisions, it's one of those things where Jean-Paul Sartre talks about the soldier is condemned, or the soldier and the lieutenant is condemned to choose, right? Who do you decide to send in knowing that it may be their last, right? And so I think in general, recognizing, using Waltzer's work and kind of some others, a lot of use kind of Socratic philosophy too, to kind of deal with these dilemmas, recognizing that a lot of things are out of your control, right? You made this choice, but you had to make this choice. And in this case, I think it was the right choice, even though it resulted in these kind of deaths of U.S. soldiers, right? It's difficult, and we have something like 7 or 8 veterans committing suicide every day, right? And this is kind of a big impetus to kind of move toward the automation of warfare, right? But I think the kind of bigger drive, at least, in these cases, is asking the broader questions: is why are we at war in Afghanistan still to this day, or in the first place, right? So there's these kind of broader political questions that, and each individual soldier has to kind of grapple with those things, and the U.S. doesn't do a very good job about helping them when they come home, because it's expensive, right? And there's a lot to be said for ways we could fund the VA better and give soldiers better therapy when they come home, but in the end, no one knows how they're going to react to having to kill, to seeing their friends die. And we forget that these are oftentimes children at war, right? Think about when you came in as a freshman here, you were 18, 19, right? And these are the people that we're often sending to war, right? We tend to think of them as more kind of older men, but they're often like babies, essentially. And we ask a lot of them. Right? So there's no good answer to how we deal with that.
We have a couple questions there, and then we'll go to you, Dr. Soper.
Yes. I'm in technology and data center technology, cool. And I'm also a veteran, so.
Perfect. We'll chat after.
I'm sorry?
We'll chat after.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. One of the things we're seeing in the inferencing model is, in the training, is that we're starting to teach these engines, we're giving them our prejudices and I guess our bad ethics, essentially, right? So I can see where the United States is probably working on that, and I don't know what you've seen from what our government is doing to teach, or to get to this more ethical war model, and what other governments are doing, right? Because what we think is ethical might be unethical from the other, warring party, or, something unexpected, right? Like you said, that general said, like, hey, we're not going to play by the rules, and we're going to do this, so we may see this as unethical. So what are you seeing from that standpoint as what's being developed? Thank you.
So, great question. So one of the problems with what we're seeing being developed is it's all secret, right? So we get kind of glimpses of it, right? The reason we have the kind of leaked NSA PowerPoints was because there was a kind of internal dilemma between the CIA and the Department of Defense at the time over who would control the drone program, right? So the CIA is not transparent, they're not accountable, and so the DoD was really pushing for that. So someone from the DoD leaked these PowerPoint slides to paint in the kind of CIA drone program in a bad light. So that's the only reason why we know, like, the ways we use metadata to target individuals, right? So as, a political scientist, you're dealing with kind of secret, limited, kind of all these different types of information, right? But we get bits and pieces here and there to kind of understand how they're using it and deploying it. And even most recently, Secretary of Air Force talked about even the Google DeepMind AlphaGo and the kind of prospects for this. So we just kind of get, snippets here and there of how they're deploying it. But in the end, we know that they're pushing to use, image recognition software in order to be able to help determine targets. They're pushing forward in facial recognition software as well, right? And so the big fear is that, and the way it's being framed today is that we're in an AI arms race with China. Right, so this idea, there's a lot of fear that China is going to beat us in the AI arms race, and that should be our impetus to kind of drive and move forth with this, right? But then also at the same time, I think we forget that we entered into treaties with the Soviet Union over ballistic missile defense systems and nuclear weapons, that if you engage with the globe, maybe they don't engage back, right? But there's always that kind of political option there. So you should kind of never close the door on there. And I think framing it in terms of this AI arms race that should be devoid of kind of international law or kind of ethics is problematic. So we'll chat more after. I've got a lot to chat with you about. Yeah.
We'll take these 2 more questions or 3, and then wrap things up for the day.
Thank you very much for your talk. A very interesting area that you're studying. I mean, part of what I take away from your talk is the repression of human ethical decision making. I mean, it's not that robots get up and fight a war. We just make decisions in a bad way. It's still humans making the decision, just mediated via technology. So kind of false dualism there between the robots making the decision and us. It's us making the decision poorly. That leads into my question, which is kind of 2-part, which is, do you see any connection between Afghanistan being the longest running war in America and a kind of compartmentalized war, an invisible war, and this technological discourse? And relatedly, ask you to sort of speculate on the normative question, what ought a democratic discourse in the age of technology look like? Because you see kind of in Trumpism a sort of reassertion of anti-technocratic, but sort of, I would say, irrational, kind of crazy, but still, not just technocratic, precise ways of talking, but to give him credit on a kind of rhetorical level that's highly moralistic and maybe kind of resonates with something more human than sort of the Obama technocratic, we don't even discuss why we're fighting this war, we just tell you how great we are at executing it with Ivy League diplomas or whatever. So, those are the 2 questions. I hope they're clear.
Yes. Yeah, thank you. So for the first half of your question, as we know, Afghanistan is kind of the longest running war in U.S. history, right? And there's, I think, a lot of reasons why. I think in this case, not so much the technology. Like the way we fought the war from the get-go was a limited number of troops on the ground engaging with local allies, right? There's a lot of kind of pros and cons to using local allies. And on the one hand, what we saw is, we essentially allied with the Northern Alliance in Afghanistan. So we were lined up with different various warlords and drug lords in order to fight against the Taliban, which they had already been doing. Right? One guy in particular, Dostum, who became the vice president of Afghanistan, was accused of war crimes by rounding anyone up he deemed to be Taliban and locking them in a shipping container until they suffocated and died. Right? So those were our kind of allies on the ground. And I think what we're missing is, in the kind of lead up to Afghanistan and Iraq war, the way we portrayed the Taliban was as like Hitler reincarnated, right? We literally called it Islamofascism and likened it to Hitler. And when you're fighting evil, then you can't negotiate with them. So even though the Taliban came to the US with kind of a surrender treaty very early on in the war, right, the US denied it, right? They weren't even going to look at it. Whereas today, we're actively negotiating with the Taliban while excluding the Afghan government. So there's really kind of, I think in Afghanistan, the reason we don't debate it more is because we don't feel like we're at war. When we were at war in the past, you had the draft in the Vietnam War, you were rationing in World War II, right? A lot of these wars were run kind of off the books, so to speak. Like we didn't have to pay for these wars, which led to kind of a massive debt crisis. And then, in addition, right, you talk to everyday people, we forget that we're at war because it's not in the news, we're not paying for it, and not that many soldiers are dying. So in the end, the American public kind of doesn't care as much, unfortunately. And it's for ideals of democratic debate, I don't think there's necessarily a good way. I think it's kind of starting. We started to see it with pushback against our support for the Saudi bombing in Yemen, right? Massive food shortages, massive outbreaks of disease in Yemen, like hundreds of thousands of people dying, right? And we're supporting the Saudi regime, which is bombing quite indiscriminately in a lot of cases. And so kind of a few high-profile cases led the US, Congress, and the Senate to, enact their war powers resolution. So I think we're starting to get it, but only in some minor places. And I'm going to go, since we're short on time, I'm going to move on to the next question.
Hi, David Simonowitz. I teach Middle East Studies in the International Studies and Language Division. Last year, I read an article in which a technology theoretician was stating that the mathematics necessary to make a fully autonomous, sentient artificial intelligence network functional would be coming online this year. And this is the kind of network which could be linked in with, again, fully autonomous battlefield robots or an army of them, of the kind that they're training or that they're developing to even do things like using human corpses to power themselves. But what this made me think of course, is this sort of Terminator vision of the future where one of these networks goes wrong. But what really struck me was one of his conclusions was that he said that when one of these networks is activated, it should be considered a capital crime to turn it off.
Yeah, so there's entire field of like robot ethics and things like that. I'm very much of the feeling that robots can't be sentient and you should be able to pour water on them, destroy them, and kill them, right? Especially because they may go awry, right? They're not necessarily going to work the way that we do, and we give them the power to take life, right? We give them that power from the get-go. It's very different than, giving robots power to kind of help you around the house, right? The kind of iRobot vision or something. And so I think in the end, right, there's tons and tons of new ethical questions about like both human-machine integration and kind of fully autonomous, like sentient robots, right? But this comes back to issues, especially being here at religious affiliated school, right? The idea of the soul, right? Can you kill something that doesn't have a soul, and can you create a soul? So in the end, I tend to land more on the side of like the pro-human side, even recognizing all of our flaws, even recognizing all the problems that come with it, like all the unforeseen issues that can arise from giving robots the power from the get-go to take life when they go awry, or even if they act as intended, right? The ways in which it can just lead to massive loss of life, right? And the idea that it wouldn't have this moral injury that soldiers have for taking a life, right? It doesn't feel bad for taking life, even if it might be sentient, right? So thankfully, I'm not a technologist and I don't have to grapple with these, but these are all the questions that we need to be asking because the future is now. All these technologies are already here. They're already being deployed on the battlefields. They're already being used for marketing to us, right? The ways that you're marketed to. You are no longer the customer, you are the product. Right? The idea when you scan your Amazon Prime app at Whole Foods, eventually they're just going to monetize that data to sell it to life insurance and health insurance companies to figure out how big of risk you are. So when you scan your Amazon Prime app at Whole Foods, make sure you're only buying the healthy foods, right? So I guess I'll end on that note because we're at time, but I'm more than happy to answer questions after or chat with any of you after. So thank you all for coming.
Please join me in thanking him again.